The bass from the sound system rattled the ice in my glass the moment I stepped out of the elevator. The 14th floor of this Atlanta high-rise was a glass box suspended in the night sky. It was the kind of place that charged you for the view and made you forget the concrete streets down below. I stood in the foyer holding a small wooden box wrapped in plain brown paper. I had carved that box from a piece of Georgia oak, a piece of the tree that used to shade my late wife garden. I wore my old charcoal suit, the one I had worn to church for 15 years. It was clean, it was pressed, but it was not Italian silk. I did not need Italian silk to know exactly who I was. I saw my son Darius across the vast room. He was 34 years old, holding a crystal champagne flute and laughing with a group of men wearing watches that cost more than a decent car. I felt a swell of pride mixed with that familiar quiet caution. He had a good heart, my boy, a heart that was too open and too easily blinded by bright lights and fast talkers. Then I saw her. Jasmine. She moved through the crowd of Atlanta elite like a shark cutting through shallow water. She wore a dress that looked like liquid gold and a smile that she turned on and off like a programmed switch. This was the woman my son wanted to marry. This was the woman he had moved into this exorbitant apartment for. I started to walk toward them, navigating through waiters carrying silver trays of caviar and people who looked right through my faded suit. Darius saw me, his face lighting up with genuine relief. "Dad, you made it," he called out, stepping forward to hug me. I hugged him back, feeling the tight tension in his shoulders. He was trying so hard to fit into this new, ruthless world. "I brought you something," I said, handing him the brown paper package. Jasmine glided over before he could even take it from my hands. She slipped her arm through his, her eyes scanning me from the scuffed toes of my leather shoes all the way up to the frayed lapels of my suit. "Roland," she said, her voice dripping with a manufactured sweetness that did not reach her cold eyes. "We were not sure you would brave the city traffic in that old rusty truck of yours." Her friends, a tight circle of women, dripping in heavy designer jewelry, turned to watch the spectacle. I kept my voice steady and perfectly polite. "A little traffic never stopped me, Jasmine," I said. Darius tried to smile, looking down at the heavy package. "What is this, Dad?" he asked. "Open it," I told him. He pulled away the brown paper, revealing the polished oak box with brass hinges. I spent 3 weeks sanding that wood by hand. It was meant to hold the watches he loved to collect so much. A quiet, mocking murmur rippled through the circle of Jasmine friends. Someone in the back let out a short, stifled laugh. Jasmine reached out and tapped the wood with the tip of her sharp, manicured nail. "Oh," she said, dragging the word out for maximum effect. "It is very rustic, Roland. Did you make this yourself out in your little garage?" I looked right at her, refusing to break eye contact. "Yes, I did," I said. "It is from the old oak tree back home, the one Darius used to climb." Jasmine let out a loud sigh, loud enough for the wealthy investors around us to hear over the pounding music. "That is so sweet," she said, turning her back slightly toward me. "But baby, it does not exactly match the aesthetic we are going for here, does it? We hired a top-tier interior designer for a reason." Darius shifted his weight awkwardly, his eyes darting between the two of us. "Jazz, come on," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the heavy bass of the speakers. "It is a nice box. He made it for me." Jasmine tightened her grip on his arm, her smile hardening into a threat. "It is a lovely thought, Roland," she said, her voice rising so the whole circle could hear her clear dismissal. "But we cannot just clutter this new place with homemade trinkets. We have an important image to maintain now for the clients." Her friends chuckled again, sipping their drinks. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but my face remained perfectly stone still. I'd spent 30 years investigating corporate fraud, staring down professional liars and thieves. I knew how to hold my ground in a hostile room. I looked at Darius, waiting for him to speak up, waiting for my son to defend his father, to defend the memory of his mother tree. But he just looked at the polished hardwood floor, his face flushed with deep embarrassment. The loud music thumped against the floor to ceiling glass walls, drowning out the heavy silence between us. He was paralyzed, caught in the gravity of this new expensive life and the predatory woman who currently controlled it. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cause a scene. I just looked at her, registering the cold, calculating ambition in her eyes. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was establishing public dominance. She was showing the entire room and my blinded son that the old man in the cheap suit had absolutely no place in their shiny, wealthy new world. The heavy bass of the music faded slightly as I stepped back from the circle of laughing faces. I needed a moment to breathe, to let the sting of my son's silence wash over me. I walked toward the massive glass doors, sliding them open to step out onto the balcony. The cold night air of Atlanta hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the party inside. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, looking out at the sprawling city lights, holding a glass of cheap bourbon I poured from the kitchen. I heard the sharp click of high heels on the concrete behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Jasmine slid the glass door shut, sealing us off from the noise of the party and from my son. She stood next to me, the city lights reflecting off the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was a thick, expensive piece of jewelry, the kind meant to intimidate rather than simply decorate. She did not bother with the sweet, fake smile out here in the dark. "You need to understand something, Roland," she said, her voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. "Darius is moving into a different world now, and you are holding him back." I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the cheap liquor burn the back of my throat. I looked out at the traffic far below us, refusing to give her the satisfaction of my anger. "Is that right?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. She stepped closer, the heavy scent of expensive perfume filling the cold air between us. "Look at yourself," she sneered, gesturing toward my faded charcoal suit. "You show up here in front of the most important investors in the city, carrying a piece of scrap wood. You look like the help, Roland. You do not belong in this tax bracket, and you certainly do not belong at this party." She crossed her arms, the diamonds catching the dim light of the balcony. "Darius is too soft to say it to your face," she continued, her eyes narrowing into sharp little slits. "He feels sorry for you. But I do not. I have spent a year building his brand, getting him into the right rooms with the right people. I'm not going to let a stubborn old man in a cheap suit ruin it all just because he wants to play the proud father." I turned my head slowly and I looked at her. I did not look at her like a father looking at his future daughter-in-law. I looked at her the way I used to look at a suspect across an interrogation table. I spent 30 years dissecting lies, finding the hidden cracks in perfectly crafted stories. I saw right through the designer dress, the expensive perfume, and the heavy diamonds. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperate need for control, and the deep, rotting greed underneath it all. She was a predator guarding her newly acquired prey. She misread my silence for defeat. Her cold smile returned sharp and victorious. "Finish your little drink, Roland," she said, pointing a manicured finger toward the sliding glass door. "Then I want you to walk to the elevator and go back to whatever sad little house you came from. Do not say goodbye to Darius. Do not cause a scene. Just disappear before you embarrass him any further." I looked down at the glass of bourbon in my hand. It was a cheap brand, probably bought just to stock the bar for people they did not care about. I placed the glass down on the thick concrete railing, the ice clinking softly against the glass. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my pride. Pride is a foolish thing to cling to when you are dealing with a snake. You do not argue with a snake, you just study its venom and you prepare the antidote. I buttoned the front of my faded suit jacket, smoothing out the worn lapels. I looked at Jasmine one last time, letting her see the absolute calm in my eyes. "You have a good evening, Jasmine," I said softly. I turned away from her, sliding the heavy glass door open and stepping back into the loud, suffocating heat of the apartment. I did not look for Darius in the crowd. I did not look at the mocking faces of her wealthy friends. I just kept my head high and walked straight toward the front door, leaving the noise and the lies behind me. The heavy oak door of the apartment clicked shut behind me, cutting off the pounding bass of the music. The hallway was perfectly quiet, lined with thick carpets and expensive art. I walked slowly toward the elevator, feeling the familiar ache in my knees. I pressed the silver button and waited. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside and looked at myself in the mirrored walls. I looked exactly like the man Jasmine thought I was. I looked like an old, tired man wearing a faded charcoal suit. I reached up and straightened my cheap tie. I let out a quiet, rough laugh. People like Jasmine only understand the surface of things. They look at a faded suit and they see weakness. They do not understand that true power never needs to shout. True power wears camouflage. The elevator chimed gently, arriving at the ground floor. I walked out into the vast, empty lobby of the building. The concierge was a young man in a sharp uniform, standing behind a marble desk. He barely looked up from his phone as I passed. He saw the scuffed toes of my shoes, and he dismissed me just like the people upstairs. I did not mind. Being invisible is a very useful thing when you are hunting a predator. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, stepping out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night. The street was lined with expensive cars parked tight against the curb. Jasmine probably pictured me walking 3 blocks in the dark, waiting for a late-night bus to take me back to a rundown neighborhood. She probably smiled, thinking about my humiliation. I stood on the sidewalk for exactly 10 seconds. A massive, midnight black Maybach glided out from the shadows of a private parking garage across the street. It moved silently, stopping perfectly flush with the curb right in front of me. The tinted windows were so dark they reflected the streetlights like solid glass. The rear door popped open, revealing an interior of immaculate cream leather and warm ambient lighting. My driver, a quiet man named Thomas, nodded his head slightly from the front seat. I stepped inside, sinking into the plush leather, and the heavy door pulled itself shut with a soft, solid click. The noise of the city vanished instantly. The cabin of the car was a fortress of absolute silence. "Take us back to the main house, Thomas," I said, leaning my head back against the seat. "Take the long way through the city. I need a minute to think." Thomas put the car in gear and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the glass tower behind us. I reached into the inside pocket of my faded suit jacket. I bypassed my regular cell phone, the cheap one I let Darius call. Instead, I pulled out a heavy encrypted satellite phone. It was a device only 3 people in the world had the number for. I dialed a direct line to my primary wealth manager in Geneva. The phone rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. "Good evening, sir," the voice said. I looked out the tinted window, watching the bright lights of Atlanta blur past. "We have a problem," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I need you to access the blind trust, the one we set up for the downtown properties." "Yes, sir," the manager replied immediately. "What are the instructions?" I thought about the heavy diamond necklace resting on Jasmine's collarbone. I thought about her mocking my late wife memory and dismissing my son pride. I took a slow, deep breath. "Freeze the shadow accounts linked to Darius' apartment," I said. "Freeze the credit lines, the maintenance subsidies, and the lease agreements. Shut it all down effective by morning." There was a brief pause on the line as the manager typed rapidly. "It is done, sir," he said. "Anything else?" "No," I replied. "Let us see who is really paying the bills." I ended the call and slipped the heavy phone back into my pocket. Jasmine believed she had conquered that glass tower. She believed she had manipulated her way into the high life using my son as her golden ticket. She had no idea that I owned the building. She had no idea that I owned the management company, the land beneath it, and the bank that financed her little luxury lifestyle. She wanted to play a game of wealth and power against an old man in a cheap suit. I smiled in the dark cabin of the Maybach. By tomorrow morning, she was going to learn what real power looked like. The morning sun filtered through the floor to ceiling windows of the boutique, catching the dust motes in the warm air. Jasmine stood in front of a full-length mirror admiring a heavy silk dress. It was a Tuesday, the perfect time for a woman of leisure to spend money while the rest of the city worked. She felt light. She felt absolutely victorious. Last night she had successfully removed the only obstacle in her path. The old man was gone and Darius was fully under her control. She turned from side to side, watching the expensive fabric move. The dress cost $4,000, but she did not care. She was not paying for it. She gathered the silk dress along with 3 pairs of designer shoes and carried them to the glass display counter. The young clerk smiled warmly, instantly, recognizing a massive sale. "Good morning, ma'am," the clerk said, ringing up the luxury items one by one. "Did you find everything you were looking for today?" Jasmine offered a thin, practiced smile. "Yes," she replied, setting her designer leather handbag on the glass. "Just these for today. Wrap the shoes separately because I'm traveling this weekend." The total came to $8,500. Jasmine did not even blink. She reached into her bag, pulling out a heavy matte black credit card. It was a secondary card linked directly to the primary wealth accounts she shared with Darius. She slid the cold metal across the glass counter, feeling the familiar rush of absolute power. The clerk took the card, inserted it into the heavy brass terminal, and waited for the approval. A sharp, unpleasant beep broke the quiet hum of the boutique. The machine flashed a bright red light. The clerk frowned slightly, pulling the card out and wiping the gold chip on his sleeve. "I apologize, Mom," the clerk said, his voice polite but suddenly nervous. "It seems to have rejected the read. Let me try it one more time." Jasmine tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the glass, letting out a sharp, annoyed sigh. "Just run it," she snapped. "Your machine is probably outdated." The clerk inserted the card a second time. Another sharp beep echoed in the quiet store. The red light flashed again, accompanied by a short string of text on the digital screen. The clerk looked up, his professional smile slipping away completely. "I am so sorry," he said, lowering his voice so the other wealthy shoppers would not hear. "The card is declined. It is asking me to confiscate the physical card, actually." Jasmine felt a hot spike of pure anger hit her chest. "Excuse me," she hissed, her voice rising sharply in the quiet room. "Do you know who I am? Run it again. There is over $100,000 in available credit on that specific account. You are making a massive mistake." The clerk took a step back, holding the heavy metal card tightly in his hand. "I cannot run it again, ma'am," he explained, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "The terminal is locked. The bank has placed a hard freeze on the account. I have to call the authorization line." "Do it," Jasmine commanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Call them right now. I want to speak to a manager, and I want you fired for this public embarrassment." She looked around the boutique, noticing 2 other wealthy women staring at her from the jewelry counter. Her face flushed with intense heat. This was not supposed to happen. She controlled the finances. She had spent the entire last year carefully moving the money, securing her untouchable position. The clerk picked up the heavy black telephone behind the counter, dialing the merchant support number. He spoke quietly for a long moment, reading off the long string of numbers on the front of her metal card. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. His eyes widened slightly and he looked back at Jasmine. He did not hand the phone over to her. "Ma'am," the clerk said, placing the receiver back on the cradle with a soft click. The bank representative said the account has been completely frozen by the primary trust holder. They said all secondary cards are void effective immediately. They instructed me to cut this card in half. Jasmine slammed her hands down on the glass counter, making the expensive display cases rattle. "What do you mean, the primary trust holder?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Darius is the primary account holder, and he is sitting in his downtown office right now. Give me my card back. You are stealing my personal property." The clerk reached under the wooden counter, pulling out a pair of heavy metal scissors. "I'm just following bank protocol, Mom," he said, his hands shaking slightly under her furious gaze. "If you have an issue, you need to contact your financial institution." He placed the heavy black card between the sharp blades and squeezed hard. The metal snapped with a loud, sharp crack, splitting the card in two. He dropped the ruined pieces into a small plastic bin. Jasmine stared at the broken pieces of plastic and metal, feeling a sudden cold drop in her stomach. That card paid for her entire life. That card paid for her clothes, her expensive dinners, and the heavy interest on her massive, hidden street debts. She reached into her bag with trembling hands, pulling out her own personal credit card. It was maxed out, hovering near the absolute limit for months, but she was entirely desperate. "Try this one," she ordered, throwing the plastic onto the glass. The clerk took the second card, running it through a different terminal. The machine beeped instantly. "Declined," he said, sliding it back across the counter without meeting her eyes. "Insufficient funds. I'm sorry, Mom, but I cannot release these luxury items to you today. Would you like me to hold them in the back while you sort out your financial situation?" The two women at the jewelry counter whispered to each other, looking directly at her burning face. The humiliation burned through her veins like battery acid. The carefully constructed illusion of her massive wealth, the flawless image she had spent a year building, was cracking wide open in the middle of a luxury store. She snatched her personal card off the counter, shoving it back into her designer bag. "Keep your cheap clothes," Jasmine spat, turning sharply on her heel. "You have just lost your best client." She stormed toward the glass doors, her high heels clicking rapidly against the polished stone floor. She pushed through the heavy doors, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. She pulled out her phone, dialing the number for Darius. It went straight to a dead voicemail. She dialed again, but the call would not even connect. The cell phone plan was tied directly to the exact same shadow accounts. A deep primal panic began to set in. The money was gone. Jasmine stood on the bright sidewalk, staring at her dead cell phone. The screen was totally black, a useless brick in her shaking hand. She hailed a passing taxi, waving frantically. She climbed into the back seat, promising the driver double the fare in cash if he hurried back to her downtown high-rise. She dug through her designer bag, scraping together the last few crumpled bills she had hidden in the lining. The ride was a blur of traffic and rising panic. She needed to get back to the apartment, get on her secure laptop, and transfer the reserve funds she had carefully hidden from Darius. The taxi pulled up to the towering glass building. Jasmine shoved the cash at the driver, not waiting for her change. She marched through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the young concierge at the marble desk. She needed the safety of her 14th floor fortress. She stepped into the mirrored elevator, hitting the button with a sharp jab of her thumb. The ride up felt agonizingly slow. The silver doors finally slid open and she stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. She walked briskly toward her door, digging her heavy brass key out of her purse, but she stopped dead in her tracks 10 feet away. A massive bright orange sticker was plastered directly across the heavy oak door, sealing the gap between the door and the frame. It was not a polite notice or a simple missed delivery slip. It was a formal legal eviction warning, printed in bold, aggressive black ink. Jasmine felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped closer, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the thick paper. She read the words, and her breath caught in her throat. Notice to vacate immediately, the paper read. The property has been seized and all access is legally revoked. She grabbed the brass handle of the door, twisting it violently. It did not budge. The locks had already been changed. The heavy brass key in her hand was completely useless. This makes absolutely no sense, she muttered to herself, her voice shaking with disbelief. I manage this lease personally. I know the property manager. She ripped the orange paper off the door, tearing the edges in her frantic rush. She scanned the fine print at the bottom of the document, looking for the name of the boutique real estate agency she supposedly worked for. But the name was not there. Instead, the eviction notice was stamped with the seal of a massive, shadowy corporate entity. It was called Apex Holdings Group. Jasmine stared at the name, her mind racing to connect the dots. She had never heard of Apex Holdings. She had brokered this lease through a private connection, a man who owed her a favor. Someone who promised to look the other way on her background checks. But this document proved her connection was a complete lie, or he had been bought out overnight. She turned around, sprinting back to the elevator. She hit the ground floor button, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She was going to tear the concierge apart. She was going to demand access to her clothes, her jewelry, and her computer. The doors opened and she marched across the grand lobby, slamming the crumpled orange paper down on the cold marble desk. What is the meaning of this? She screamed, no longer caring who heard her. Who authorized you to change my locks? The young concierge did not flinch. He did not look intimidated the way he usually did. He calmly reached under the desk, pulling out a thick manila envelope. I'm sorry, ma'am, the concierge said, his voice flat and perfectly rehearsed. Building management has been completely restructured as of 6 o'clock this morning. We are under strict orders from the new ownership. They instructed me to hand you this if you attempted to re-enter the premises. Jasmine snatched the envelope from his hand, ripping the top open. She pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents bound by a thick metal clip. She flipped through the first few pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. It was a comprehensive audit of the lease agreement detailing massive discrepancies, falsified income statements, and unauthorized secondary tenants. They had found everything. They had completely dismantled her fake real estate profile in a matter of hours. Who owns Apex Holdings? She demanded, looking up at the concierge with wild, desperate eyes. Call the manager. I want a name right now. The concierge folded his hands on the desk, looking at her with a mixture of pity and cold indifference. I do not have a name for you, Mom, he said gently. Apex Holdings is a private trust. They own the entire block, actually. They bought out the previous management company late last night in a closed cash deal. The representative who dropped off those papers was very clear. If you do not leave the lobby in the next 3 minutes, I am instructed to call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Jasmine stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping slightly on the polished floor. A closed cash deal, buying an entire city block overnight. That required a level of wealth she could barely comprehend. It was not just rich. It was wealthy, the kind of silent, brutal wealth that could erase a person from the map without leaving a fingerprint. She looked down at the documents in her hand, feeling the icy grip of total ruin closing around her throat. She had no home, no money, and no phone. The trap had slammed shut, and she was completely, utterly locked out. She looked back at the concierge, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. Where is my fiancé? She asked. Where is Darius? Does he know about this? The concierge shook his head slowly. I have not seen him today, Mom, he replied. But the eviction notice applies to both of you. The entire unit has been secured by private security. Jasmine turned away from the desk, walking numbly toward the glass revolving doors. The bright Atlanta morning suddenly felt cold and entirely hostile. She pushed through the heavy glass, stepping back out onto the busy sidewalk. She had to find Darius. He was the only lifeline she had left. He had his own business accounts, his own sayings. If she could just get to him before he saw the eviction notice, she could spin a story. She could blame the bank, blame a corporate error, blame anyone but herself. She gripped the heavy manila envelope tightly against her chest, her mind spinning with dark, desperate lies. She hailed another cab, heading toward his downtown office, praying she was not already too late. The taxi slammed to a halt in front of the small boutique marketing agency. Jasmine threw the last of her crumpled bills at the driver and scrambled out onto the pavement. She pushed through the glass doors of the office building, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took the elevator to the third floor, running past the empty reception desk. She burst into the private office of Darius, ready to spin the performance of her life. Darius was pacing behind his heavy wooden desk, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His tie was loosened and his face was pale, pulled tight with a deep, unfamiliar panic. He ran a hand through his hair, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. "I do not understand," Darius said, his voice cracking slightly. "What do you mean the accounts are under review? I have a payroll to meet by Friday and vendor invoices that are past due. You cannot just freeze my entire operating budget without a formal notice." He stopped pacing when he saw Jasmine standing in the doorway. He held up a finger signaling for her to wait. He listened for another agonizing minute, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. "Fine," Darius muttered, his tone defeated. "I will come down to the main branch this afternoon. Just send me the compliance forms." He tossed the phone onto the desk, letting out a long, ragged breath. He looked up at Jasmine, his eyes filled with absolute confusion. "What is wrong?" Jasmine asked, stepping into the room and closing the door softly behind her. She poured every ounce of fake loving concern into her voice. She walked over to him, placing her hands gently on his tense shoulders. "It is the bank," Darius said, rubbing his temples in slow, tight circles. "They just froze my primary business accounts. They froze my savings, my personal credit lines, and the emergency fund. They said there is a hard lock on my social security number pending a massive fraud investigation. I cannot access a single dollar JAWS. I do not even have the money to buy lunch right now." Jasmine felt a cold thrill of validation. She was not the only one locked out. The attack was comprehensive, but she kept her face perfectly composed, mirroring his deep distress. She let out a soft, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God," Jasmine whispered, her eyes widening in feigned horror. "Darius, it is not just your accounts." She opened her designer bag, pulling out the crumpled orange eviction notice in the heavy manila envelope. She placed them carefully on his desk, right next to his phone. "I went to the apartment this morning," she continued, letting a single perfect tear fall down her cheek. "The locks are changed. There was an eviction notice on the door from some massive holding company. The concierge said they bought the building last night and kicked us out. They cut my secondary cards too. We have nothing, baby. We are completely locked out of our own lives." Darius stared at the orange paper, his mouth slightly open. He reached out his hand, trembling, and picked up the heavy legal documents. He read the front page, his eyes scanning the aggressive black text. "This is impossible," he whispered, shaking his head. "You said you knew the property manager. You said the lease was completely secure." "I did know him," Jasmine cried, leaning against his chest and wrapping her arms around his waist. "But this new company, this Apex Holdings, they bought him out overnight. They are ruthless, Darius. But that is not the worst part. I know exactly why this is happening. I know who did this to us." Darius looked down at her, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Who?" he asked, his voice raw. Who has the power to freeze my bank accounts and buy an entire building in one night? Jasmine stepped back, looking deeply into his eyes. She let her face harden, shifting from a helpless victim to an angry, protective partner. Think about it, Darius, she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. Think about last night. Think about who left that party humiliated and full of bitter anger. Darius blinked, his mind struggling to keep up with her rapid pivot. My father, he asked, sounding completely bewildered. Roland. Jazz, that is crazy. My dad is a retired insurance adjuster. He drives a 20-year-old truck. He does not have the money or the connections to orchestrate a massive corporate takeover. You are so blind to him, Jasmine snapped, pacing across the small office. He spent 30 years investigating corporate fraud, Darius. He knows the banking system inside and out. He knows exactly how to file false reports, how to trigger automated fraud alerts, and how to weaponize the system against people he hates. She walked back to him, grabbing his hands and squeezing them tightly. He was so angry last night, she pleaded, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. He felt insulted because we did not want his cheap wooden box in our beautiful new home. He felt like he was losing control of you. So he went home and he used his old industry contacts to file a massive fake fraud report against your social security number. That automatically triggered the bank to freeze your assets. Darius shook his head, stepping away from her. No, he said, his voice rising in defensive denial. My dad would never do that. He loves me. He would never sabotage my business just because you insulted his suit. He did not just sabotage your business, Jasmine yelled, pointing a sharp finger at his chest. He sabotaged our life. He probably tipped off the property owners, telling them we were running some kind of scam, forcing them to break the lease. He wants you broke, Darius. He wants you desperate, so you have to go crawling back to his sad, pathetic little house. He wants to prove that you cannot survive without him. Darius stood perfectly still, his eyes darting back and forth as he processed her poisonous words. The seed of doubt carefully planted began to take root in his panicked mind. He remembered the cold, hard look in the eyes of his father before he left the balcony. He remembered the quiet, terrifying calm. You have to cut him off, Jasmine insisted, stepping close again and resting her head against his shoulder. He is toxic, baby. He is jealous of your success and he is trying to destroy us. We have to fight back. We have to secure what is ours before he takes everything away forever. Darius looked at the eviction notice and then at his dead phone. The overwhelming pressure of the morning crushed his usual common sense. He wrapped his arms around Jasmine, pulling her close, entirely blind to the venom in her veins. I will fix this, he whispered into her hair. I will not let him ruin us. The elevator doors opened silently, revealing the top floor of the Apex Holdings tower. I stepped out into the sprawling, quiet space of my true office. There was no company logo on the wall and no receptionist waiting at a desk. The entire penthouse was a fortress of glass steel and dark mahogany, sitting 40 stories above the busy Atlanta streets. I walked across the thick hand-woven rug, taking off my faded charcoal suit jacket and draping it over the back of a heavy leather chair. I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon, a very different bottle from the cheap liquor served at my son party the night before. I walked over to the floor, to ceiling windows looking down at the city. It was a beautiful, sprawling grid of movement and money. I owned a significant portion of that grid, but I never felt the need to wear it on my sleeve. Wealth is a heavy armor, and you only put it on when you are going to war. Today I was fully armed. The private elevator hummed quietly, and the heavy metal doors slid open again. Calvin walked into the office carrying a thick, expandable leather briefcase. Calvin and I went back 20 years. He was the best private investigator and forensic accountant on the Eastern Seaboard. He was a man who spoke in numbers and lived in the shadows of corporate data. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the room before he settled on me. "Good morning, Roland," Calvin said, setting his heavy briefcase down on my massive oak desk. "I see you decided to wake up the sleeping giant today." I turned away from the window, taking a slow sip of my bourbon. "Good morning, Calvin," I replied, walking over to join him at the desk. I did not wake up the giant for fun. Someone decided to kick the hornet nest and target my family. "Did you bring what I asked for?" Calvin nodded, his expression turning entirely professional and grim. He popped the brass locks on his briefcase. "I brought everything, Roland," he said, pulling out a massive, densely packed file. "And I have to tell you, it is much worse than you suspected. She is not just a gold digger looking for a free ride." I sat down in my leather chair, setting my glass down on a thick slate coaster. I folded my hands on the desk, waiting for him to speak. "Give me the summary, Calvin," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Tell me exactly who my son invited into his life." Calvin opened the thick file, spreading out a series of financial records, background checks, and heavily redacted police reports across the polished mahogany. He tapped a finger against a photograph of Jasmine taken from a surveillance camera outside a cheap motel. "Her real name is not even Jasmine." Calvin began leaning over the desk. "It is a fabricated identity created about 3 years ago. Before that, she was operating under 2 different names in 3 different states. She is a professional Roland, a highly organized serial con artist." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach, but I kept my face perfectly still. "Go on," I said, motioning for him to continue. "She targets a very specific demographic," Calvin explained, pointing to a stack of bank statements. "She finds men with access to capital, but who are emotionally vulnerable. She isolated a wealthy widower in Chicago 5 years ago, drained his retirement accounts through a fake investment shell company, and vanished before the civil courts could even serve her papers. She did it again in Miami 2 years later, targeting a young software developer. She creates a lavish fake lifestyle to draw them in, makes them feel powerful, and then she bleeds them completely dry." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the black and white surveillance photo of the woman who had mocked my dead wife memory just 12 hours ago. "And now she has her hooks deep into Darius," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the large room. Calvin nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "Yes," he replied. "But this time she is operating on a much tighter schedule. She is not just greedy, Roland. She is absolutely desperate." "Why is she desperate?" I asked, leaning forward again. Calvin pulled out a final thin folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. "Because she made a massive mistake 6 months ago," he said. "She borrowed a very large sum of money to fund this fake luxury real estate persona. She needed the designer clothes, the expensive cars, and the VIP access to catch a fish as big as Darius. But she did not borrow that money from a bank." I opened the thin folder, looking at a series of wire transfers and a single terrifying photograph of a man standing outside the high-rise apartment building. "She borrowed it from a local, highly organized loan shark." Calvin continued, his voice tight with warning. "A man named Silas. And Silas does not care about civil court or property laws. He cares about his return on investment. Jasmine owes him close to $500,000, and her deadline is the end of this month. If she does not deliver the payout she promised from Darius, Silas is going to collect his debt in blood." I closed the folder, the heavy silence of the penthouse pressing in on us. She had painted my son into a corner with a lethal predator waiting just outside the door. She was going to drain his accounts, hand the money to a violent criminal, and leave Darius to take the fall. I stood up from my desk, walking back over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Thank you, Calvin," I said, looking out at the city below, feeling a cold, calculated fury settle into my bones. "You did exceptional work." "What is your next move, Roland?" Calvin asked, packing his files back into the heavy briefcase. I finished my bourbon, letting the burn steady my nerves. I'm going to let her panic, I replied, never taking my eyes off the glass towers below. I'm going to cut off every single avenue of escape and watch her walk right into my trap. Jasmine left the small marketing agency feeling the suffocating weight of the Atlanta afternoon heat pressing down on her shoulders. She walked briskly down the crowded concrete sidewalk, her designer heels clicking a frantic, irregular rhythm against the pavement. She needed to get to her car. The white luxury SUV was parked in a subterranean garage 2 blocks away from the office. It was the only asset she had left, the only thing not tied directly to the frozen apartment lease or the seized bank accounts. She descended the dark concrete stairs, stepping into the dim, fluorescent-lit belly of the parking structure. The air down here was thick, heavy with the smell of old exhaust and damp concrete. She pulled her expensive leather jacket tighter around her body, suddenly feeling very cold. She reached blindly into her designer bag, her trembling fingers desperately searching for her keys. She pressed the unlock button, hearing the heavy, familiar chirp of the vehicle echoing in the empty, silent garage. She reached out for the chrome door handle, desperate to get inside and lock the doors, but a massive, heavy hand slammed flat against the tinted window glass, holding the door firmly shut. Jasmine gasped loudly, stumbling backward, dropping her expensive leather bag onto the greasy, stained floor. 2 men stepped out from the deep shadows behind a concrete pillar, seamlessly blocking her only path to the exit ramp. They wore dark, unassuming clothes, but their physical presence swallowed all the breathable air in the room. A 3rd man walked slowly, purposefully around the front grille of the white SUV. It was Silas. He did not look like a street-level thug. He looked like a weary, highly successful businessman, wearing a tailored gray suit and a calm, terrifyingly blank expression. Silas stopped a few feet away from her, looking down at the spilled contents of her designer bag scattered across the filthy concrete. "Hello, Jasmine," Silas said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly quiet. "Or whatever fake name you are using this month. It is very hard to keep track when you change cities and identities so fast." Jasmine felt her knees go completely weak, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of her neck. "Silas," she stammered, her voice barely a rough whisper. "I can explain everything. The timeline just got a little complicated this morning. We hit a temporary banking snag with the primary accounts." Silas tilted his head slightly, letting out a short, hollow laugh that echoed in the empty space. "A banking snag," he repeated, stepping closer, forcing her to back up against the cold metal of her car door. "I do not think being evicted from a luxury high-rise and having all your credit cards destroyed by a retail clerk counts as a simple banking snag, Jasmine. I think it counts as a complete catastrophic failure of your operation." Jasmine swallowed hard, her mind racing to find a lie, any lie that would save her life. "You know about the apartment?" she asked, her terrified eyes darting between the 3 silent men. Silas reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored gray suit, slowly pulling out a folded piece of paper. He flicked it open with one hand, holding it up to the dim, fluorescent light. "I know absolutely everything," he said softly. "I know your Mark Darius had his entire operating budget frozen at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I know you were thrown out of your 14th floor playground by a holding company nobody can trace. I know that you currently possess absolutely 0 liquid assets, and most importantly, Jasmine, I know that you owe me $500,000, including the late fees." "I have the money," Jasmine lied frantically, her voice pitching up in pure, unfiltered panic. "Darius has a massive secondary trust fund. It is locked behind some old family paperwork, but I'm getting him to sign it over to me today. I just need a few more days, Silas. I promise you the final payout is massive. It will cover the principal and double your requested interest. Just give me until the end of the week and you will have every single penny." Silas stepped completely into her personal space, pressing his heavy hand flat against the car window right next to her face. He leaned in close, and she could smell the peppermint on his breath, a sharp contrast to the cold, absolute murder in his dark eyes. "You do not dictate the terms to me," he whispered, his tone dropping to a dangerous rumble. "You borrowed my capital to buy those expensive shoes, that flashy silk dress, and this luxury car. You used my money to build a trap for a rich boy, and you promised me a massive return on my investment. Now the rich boy is totally broke, and you are standing in a dirty parking garage lying to my face." He backed away slowly, straightening his silk tie and brushing a speck of dust off his lapel. "I am a very reasonable man," Silas said, smoothing his jacket with calm precision. "I do not want to ruin the nice leather upholstery of this vehicle. So I'm going to give you exactly 48 hours. You have until Friday night to deliver $500,000 in clean, untraceable cash. I do not care if you have to rob a federal bank or sell your own organs on the black market. If I do not have my money by Friday night, my associates here will not be asking you polite questions in a parking garage. They will simply put you in the trunk, and you will never see the sun again." Silas turned his back on her, walking slowly toward the concrete exit ramp. His two massive enforcers lingered for an extra second, staring at her with dead, empty eyes before turning quietly to follow their boss. "Do not try to run, Jasmine," Silas called out over his shoulder, his voice echoing loudly in the concrete cavern. "You do not have the money for a plane ticket anyway." Jasmine slid slowly down the side of the white SUV, collapsing completely onto the greasy concrete floor. Her chest to heave with violent silent souffle, fighting for air in the damp garage. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, surrounded by her spilled makeup and the shattered pieces of her fake life. The grand illusion was entirely dead. She was no longer a powerful luxury real estate broker pulling the strings of a wealthy, gullible heir. She was a trapped rat staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun. She needed $500,000 by Friday, or she was going to die. She wiped her face, roughly her bitter tears, mixing with the dark dirt of the garage floor. Darius was completely useless to her now, his business accounts locked tightly by the bank. There was only one source of real money left in the family. She had to bypass Darius completely and go straight for the root of the massive wealth. She had to completely destroy Roland. Jasmine sat alone on the cold, greasy concrete floor for a very long time. She finally pulled herself up, her entire body shaking violently from the adrenaline. She brushed the dark dirt off her expensive leather jacket with trembling hands. She gathered her spilled makeup, shoving the expensive tubes back into her designer bag. She climbed into the driver's seat of the white SUV and locked all the heavy doors instantly. She needed money, and she needed it immediately. Silas was not a man who made empty threats. He would kill her by Friday without a second thought. Darius had mentioned a secondary savings account, once an emergency investment fund that he rarely touched. She had memorized his secure passwords many months ago. She pulled her sleek silver laptop from the back seat, resting it heavily against the steering wheel. She opened the bright screen, the harsh light illuminating her pale, terrified face in the dark parking garage. She connected to a secure cellular network, her perfectly manicured fingers flying desperately across the keyboard. She logged into his personal banking portal, completely bypassing the frozen business accounts. She navigated through the complex menus, searching for the hidden safety net. She found the emergency fund tucked away under a generic label. It held exactly $600,000. Her heart leaped wildly in her chest. This was her absolute lifeline. This was the exact amount she needed to pay Silas and disappear from Atlanta forever. She initiated a massive wire transfer, routing the entire balance directly to her untraceable shell company in Nevada. She typed in the necessary confirmation codes, her breath hitching in her throat, and hit the final submit button. A small blue circle spun on the bright screen loading the massive transaction. She held her breath, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned a sharp white. "Just process the money," she whispered to the empty car. "Just process the money and let me go." The blue circle vanished suddenly. A large, bright red error message flashed aggressively across the screen. Transaction denied. The bold text read, blinking twice. Additional authorization required immediately. Please contact your local branch manager. Jasmine let out a piercing scream of pure, unfiltered frustration, slamming her closed fists hard against the steering wheel. She could not accept a digital denial. The machine did not understand the violent men waiting for her. She needed to look a human being in the eye and force them to release those funds today. She threw the silver laptop onto the passenger seat and started the loud engine. She drove recklessly out of the dark garage, speeding dangerously through the heavy Atlanta traffic, heading straight toward the main branch of the downtown financial district. She parked illegally in front of the massive stone building, leaving the engine running and the hazard lights flashing. She rushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, her designer heels clicking frantically on the highly polished marble floor. She completely ignored the long teller line full of ordinary people. She marched directly toward the glass-walled offices in the strict back area, targeting a senior account manager she had met with Darius a few months prior. She pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking, startling the middle-aged man sitting behind the large oak desk. "David," she said, her voice breathless and full of manufactured panic. "I need your professional help immediately. Darius is in the middle of a massive corporate acquisition, and his primary accounts were frozen by a random security glitch. We need to push a wire transfer from his secondary emergency fund right now, or he will lose the entire multi-million-dollar deal." The bank manager stood up slowly, adjusting his silk tie, looking highly uncomfortable with her sudden intrusion. "Jasmine," he said, his voice hesitant and cautious. "I'm fully aware of the hard hold on the accounts today. Darius called me earlier this morning, but I cannot authorize a wire transfer of that massive magnitude, especially not to an unverified external account in Nevada. It is strictly against standard federal banking regulations." Jasmine leaned heavily over the desk, planting her hands flat on the polished wood surface. "Do not talk to me about federal regulations, David," she hissed, dropping the sweet fiancé act completely and exposing her true desperation. "I have his secure passwords. I have his full legal power of attorney for all major business transactions. You know exactly who we are. You know exactly how much capital Darius brings to this specific branch. If you do not push this wire through right this second, he will pull every single dime of his wealth out of your bank by Monday morning." The manager sighed heavily, sinking back down into his expensive leather chair. He turned his large computer monitor so she could clearly see the screen. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, bringing up the master file for the emergency investment fund. "You do not understand the true structure of this wealth, Jasmine," the manager explained quietly, pointing a gold pin at the complex financial flowcharts on the screen. "Darius does not actually own this money. He is merely a listed secondary beneficiary. The entire $600,000, along with the luxury apartment building you lived in, the business credit lines, and the massive operational capital are all securely held within an ironclad blind family trust." Jasmine felt the hot blood drain completely from her face, staring blankly at the glowing screen. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the cold panic rising sharply in her throat again. "Darius is a successful marketing chief executive. He built his own massive company from the ground up. He built a marketing company," the manager corrected, gently looking at her with quiet pity. "But the massive seed money, the corporate safety nets, and the commercial real estate, they all belong exclusively to the trust. I cannot release a single dollar from that secondary fund today because Darius is not the primary signatory. He does not have the legal authority to authorize any transfer over $10,000 without a verified countersignature. Jasmine gripped the sharp edge of the oak desk, her knees threatening to buckle completely beneath her weight. Who is the primary signatory? She asked, her voice entirely hollow and trembling with a deep consuming dread. Who controls the family trust? The manager clicked a final button, bringing up a highly secure authorization profile. He turned the screen even further toward her. The primary trust holder, the manager said, reading the bold black name on the confidential file, is his father, Roland. He holds the absolute exclusive keys to the entire financial empire. Jasmine stared at the name on the screen, unable to breathe. Roland. The old man in the cheap faded suit. The man she had publicly humiliated and banished from the glass high-rise just last night. The terrifying truth finally crashed down over her in a suffocating wave. Darius was nothing but a highly paid, glorified employee in his own life. His father, the man she had dismissed as a pathetic, poor, retired insurance adjuster, was the true architect of the entire massive fortune. He was the invisible hand who bought the building. He was the cold force who froze the credit cards. He was the one holding the leash, and he had just pulled it tight, choking her completely. She had targeted the absolute wrong man. Jasmine stumbled out of the bank, the heavy glass doors closing slowly behind her. The bright midday sun felt like a harsh spotlight on her total failure. She walked quickly back to her illegally parked white SUV, her mind spinning with a cold, desperate clarity. Silas wanted his $500,000 by Friday night. The violent men in the dark garage were not a distant nightmare. They were a ticking clock counting down the last hours of her life. Darius was completely locked out of the family trust, rendered entirely useless by the bank freeze. The old man, Roland, was the absolute undisputed gatekeeper of the massive wealth. She climbed into the driver's seat, locking the heavy doors immediately. She could not negotiate with Roland. He knew exactly what she was. He had engineered this entire financial execution, stripping her of the luxury apartment and destroying her credit cards in a single morning. She needed a way to bypass his ironclad consent completely and legally. She rested her head against the leather steering wheel, taking slow, ragged breaths. How do you steal a financial empire from a man who built it from the ground up? She asked the empty car. You do not ask for the heavy brass keys. You convince the entire world that he is no longer mentally fit to hold them. A dark, vicious idea began to form in her desperate, racing mind. Plan B. If Roland was legally declared mentally incompetent, his required signature would be completely worthless. The primary control of the massive family trust would automatically default to his only living heir, Darius. And Darius was still completely under her emotional control, blinded by her fake tears in his downtown office. He still believed his father was a bitter, jealous old man trying to ruin their beautiful life out of pure spite. She started the engine, pulling aggressively away from the curb. She could not go back to the locked, secure luxury apartment. She drove to a quiet, dimly lit public library on the faded edge of the city. It was the perfect place to work entirely anonymous and full of quiet shadows. She found a secluded wooden desk in the back corner, hiding behind a tall row of dusty, forgotten reference books. She opened her silver laptop, connecting to the unsecured public network. She had spent the last 3 years forging lease agreements, faking tax returns, and building phantom employment records. She knew exactly how to manipulate the slow, blind legal system. She just needed to scale up her ambition. She needed to legally erase a man's mind. She began to search for legal templates, her perfectly manicured fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic, lethal energy. She downloaded a standard sweeping power of attorney document valid in the state of Georgia. She carefully altered the text, stripping away all the standard protective clauses and the safety limits. This was not a document for a loving son stepping in to help pay the hospital bills. This was a financial guillotine designed to sever the old man from his money forever. The revised document granted Darius absolute immediate control over all bank accounts, commercial real estate holdings, and private trusts belonging to Roland. It gave him the unlimited power to liquidate heavy assets, authorize massive international wire transfers, and bypass all secondary banking security protocols. But a single piece of legal paper was not enough. She needed a rock-solid reason for the sudden sweeping transfer of power. The bank would ask questions, and she needed a terrifying, undeniable answer. She opened a sophisticated graphic design program, pulling up a hidden collection of blank medical letterheads stored on a secure digital drive. She selected the official logo of a prominent, highly respected neurological clinic in downtown Atlanta. She began to draft a devastating, irreversible medical evaluation for Roland. She typed out the clinical jargon with cold, absolute precision. Severe, rapid onset cognitive decline. Advanced vascular dementia complicated by acute paranoia. Immediate total loss of executive function. The patient is highly susceptible to financial confusion and represents a clear present danger to his own estate. She adjusted the page margins, added a fake randomized patient identification number, and matched the standard medical font perfectly. She added a signature block at the bottom, assigning the fake diagnosis to a real licensed neurologist in the city. It looked terrifyingly authentic, a death sentence printed on crisp white paper. She sat back in the hard wooden chair, staring at the glowing screen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The trap was almost completely built. With these forged documents, she could force the stubborn bank manager to recognize Darius as the sole master of the massive fortune. She could authorize the wire transfer to Silas, pay off her lethal violent debt, and vanish from Atlanta before the legal system even realized what had happened. But the paperwork was still just a digital illusion floating on a screen. She needed physical signatures in dark ink, and she needed an official state, recognized notary stamp to make the forgery completely bulletproof. She needed desperate people who were willing to bend the heavy law for fast cash. Jasmine printed the heavy stack of documents at a local copy shop, paying with the last few crumpled bills from her designer bag. The crisp white paper felt like a loaded weapon in her hands. She drove her white SUV to the industrial edge of the city, pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown urgent care clinic. She knew this place from her previous scams. It was run by a disgraced physician named Vance. He had lost his hospital privileges years ago, drowning in massive malpractice suits and heavy gambling debts. He was exactly the kind of desperate man she needed to legitimize her lethal trap. She walked through the empty waiting room, completely ignoring the flickering fluorescent lights, and pushed her way directly into his messy back office. Vance looked up from his cluttered wooden desk, his eyes completely bloodshot and his white coat heavily stained with old coffee. "What do you want, Jasmine?" he asked, his voice rough and incredibly tired. "I'm not writing any more fake prescription pads for you today." Jasmine locked the heavy wooden door behind her and placed the forged medical evaluation squarely on the center of his desk. "I do not need cheap pills, Vance," she said smoothly, leaning forward. "I need your official signature and your active medical license number right at the bottom of this single page." Vance picked up the crisp paper, his tired eyes scanning the devastating diagnosis of advanced vascular dementia. He shook his head slowly, pushing the document back across the desk toward her. "This is a total legal execution," he whispered, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "If the state medical board ever audits this specific file, they will revoke my license forever and put me in a federal prison cell." Jasmine reached deep into her coat pocket, pulling out a thick, white envelope of emergency cash, the absolute last of her secret reserves. She tossed $3,000 in crisp $100 bills onto his messy desk. The money scattered across the wood, covering the messy patient files. "You are already going to prison for your massive gambling debts, Vance," she said, looking him dead in the eye without a single shred of pity. "Take the cash, sign the paper, and you can pay off your violent bookie tonight." Vance stared at the scattered green bills for a long, heavy moment. The suffocating weight of his own desperate life completely crushed his medical ethics. He picked up his expensive silver pen, scribbled his highly practiced signature across the bottom line, and stamped his official state-recognized medical seal right next to it. Jasmine snatched the document instantly, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her face. The medical trap was completely set, and it was absolutely flawless. Now she just needed the legal hammer to drive the final nail into the coffin. She left the dark clinic and drove 10 blocks south, parking the white SUV in front of a dirty storefront. The faded neon sign in the window advertised quick cash loans and instant notary services. She walked inside the cheap bell above the glass door, chiming loudly in the small, dusty room. A heavy, balding man named Leo sat behind a thick pane of bulletproof glass, chewing slowly on a wooden toothpick. He was a highly corrupt notary public, a man who had helped her forge fake property deeds during her very first real estate con years ago. "Hello, Leo," Jasmine said, sliding the thick power of attorney document through the narrow metal slot in the security glass. "I need a massive, completely undocumented favor today, and I'm in a very big hurry." Leo picked up the heavy document, scanning the sweeping, limitless legal powers granted entirely to Darius. He looked up at her, chewing his toothpick with a slow, calculating rhythm. "The signature line for the old man is completely blank," Leo pointed out, tapping the paper heavily with his thick finger. "I cannot notarize a blank legal document, Jasmine. The state law says the primary signatory has to be standing right here in my dirty lobby showing me a valid government-issued identification. We do not have time for the slow law today, Leo." Jasmine countered, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. She slid her last $2,000 in cash through the narrow glass slot, pushing the money directly under his hands. "The old man is completely senile." She lied effortlessly, her face shifting into a mask of pure, tragic concern. "He cannot leave his house, and his hands shake too much to hold a pen properly in public. My fiancé needs this document stamped today so we can access the family trust and pay for his emergency medical care. You stamp it right now and I will get the old man to scribble his pathetic name on it tonight. Nobody in the city will ever check the digital timestamp." Leo looked at the thick pile of cash and then looked around the empty, silent lobby. He reached into his bottom drawer, pulling out his heavy brass notary stamp. He pressed it down hard onto the crisp white paper, leaving a deep official seal in the corner. He signed his name with a quick, careless flourish, officially validating the completely fraudulent transfer of massive wealth. He slid the legalized weapon back through the glass slot, pocketing the cash instantly. Jasmine folded the documents carefully, sliding them into her designer leather bag. She walked back out into the bright, suffocating afternoon sun, her heart beating with a fierce, entirely triumphant rhythm. She had the ironclad medical proof of absolute insanity, and she had the legally binding financial key to an empire. Silas and his violent threats faded slightly into the background of her mind. She just needed one final crucial piece to complete the total destruction of Roland. She needed to drive to the rundown neighborhood stand in the kitchen of the old man and force him to physically sign his own death warrant. I sat at my massive oak desk in the Apex penthouse, watching a blinking red dot move across a digital map of Atlanta. Calvin sat across from me, his fingers typing rapidly on a sleek black laptop. He did not look up from the glowing screen as the red dot finally stopped moving. "She just left a highly corrupt notary public on the south side," Calvin said, his voice flat and entirely analytical. Before that, she spent 20 minutes inside an urgent care clinic run by a disgraced doctor named Vance. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, feeling the cold ice touch my lips. "What is she building, Calvin?" I asked. Calvin hit a final key and a digital copy of a document flashed onto my large monitor. I tapped into the clinic network the moment her GPS registered the location. Calvin explained. She paid Vance in cash, but the desperate idiot saved a copy of the drafted file on his local hard drive. "Take a look at your new medical history, Roland." I leaned forward, reading the crisp black text on the bright screen. It was a formal medical diagnosis declaring me completely incompetent. Advanced vascular dementia complicated by acute paranoia. It was a legal death sentence designed specifically to strip away my control of the family trust. "She is going for a full conservatorship," Calvin continued, leaning back in his heavy chair. "She got the doctor to declare you legally insane, and she paid the dirty notary to stamp a blank power of attorney document. She's going to bypass the bank freeze by making Darius your absolute legal guardian today." I stared at the fake diagnosis, feeling a deep, heavy disgust for the woman my son loved. She was not just a simple thief. She was a lethal predator, willing to erase a man's entire life just to save her own skin. If she succeeded with this lie, she would not only steal my wealth, but she would effectively lock me away in a medical facility, stripping me of all basic human rights. Darius would be left completely alone, trapped in a fake marriage with a monster who held his financial leash. "Do you want me to call the police right now?" Calvin asked, reaching for his secure phone. "I can have her arrested for criminal forgery before she even makes it back to the highway. We have the digital footprint and the camera footage from the clinic lobby. It is a completely airtight felony case, Roland." "No," I said quietly, holding up my hand to stop him immediately. "Do not touch her, Calvin. A simple forgery charge is not enough. She will just post bail, hire a slick defense attorney, and spend the next 5 years poisoning my son's mind with more lies. She will tell him I fabricated the evidence and used my massive wealth to bribe the doctor just to frame her. She will play the helpless victim, and Darius is too blinded by her act to see the truth. I need to expose her true nature in a way that Darius can never unsee. I need her to confess her sins while she thinks she is winning." "So what is the play here?" Calvin asked, closing his laptop with a soft snap. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the coat rack and grabbing my faded charcoal suit jacket. "She needs my physical signature on that power of attorney to make the trap work," I said, slipping the cheap fabric over my shoulders. "She cannot forge my handwriting perfectly because the bank has my signature on file for 100 different trust documents. She has to come to me, and she has to force me to sign it today." Calvin narrowed his eyes, fully understanding the dangerous game I was initiating. "She thinks you live in the old house on Elm Street," he said. "The small one Darius grew up in." "Exactly," I replied, checking my silver watch. "I have not lived in that house for 10 years, but I keep it perfectly maintained, just for appearances. She thinks I'm a poor broken old man living in a dusty time capsule. Let us give her exactly what she wants to see." I looked at Calvin, my voice hardening with absolute resolve. "I want you to go to the Elm Street house right now, Calvin. I want high-definition cameras hidden in the living room, the kitchen, and the front hallway. I want military-grade microphones planted under the tables and inside the lamps. I want every single corner of that house wired to record a cinematic masterpiece." Calvin nodded slowly, a dark, grim smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You are going to let her spring the trap," he said softly. "I'm going to walk right into it," I replied, walking toward the private elevator. "I'm going to play the confused, senile old fool she desperately needs me to be. I will let her threaten me. I will let her manipulate the situation, and I will give her all the rope she needs to hang herself publicly." Calvin stood up, grabbing his heavy leather briefcase. "I will have the house completely wired in 2 hours, Roland," he said. "The video feed will route directly to my secure servers downtown. We will capture every single word she breathes." "Good," I said, stepping into the elevator car. The heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet cabin. I rode down to the ground floor, preparing my mind for the performance ahead. I'd spent 30 years watching criminals lie to my face. I knew exactly how they moved, how they spoke, and how they gloated when they thought they had won. Jasmine was driving across the city right now, carrying a stack of fake papers, believing she was the smartest person in Atlanta. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was walking onto a soundstage I built specifically for her destruction. I was going to give her the greatest acting challenge of her miserable life, and I was going to make sure my son had a front row seat for the premiere. The afternoon sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the faded porch of the Elm Street house. I sat in my old worn armchair in the living room. I wore a heavy knitted cardigan, the kind an old man wears when his blood runs thin. I had a thick blanket draped over my knees. The house was perfectly quiet, but I knew Calvin was watching through the lenses of 6 hidden cameras. I had spent 30 years setting traps for professional liars, and this was my final masterpiece. I heard the heavy crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. I did not move quickly. I waited for the heavy knock on the front door. It came a moment later, frantic and loud. I gripped the wooden arms of my chair, pushing myself up with a slow, deliberate groan. I shuffled across the worn hardwood floor, making sure my steps were heavy and slightly uneven. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door open. Jasmine stood on my front porch. She had completely stripped away the arrogant, mocking predator from the party last night. Her designer jacket was gone, replaced by a simple wrinkled sweater. Her makeup was deliberately smudged, making her look exhausted and entirely broken. She was breathing heavily, holding a thick manila envelope tightly against her chest. "Roland," she gasped, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. "Please, you have to let me in. We are in terrible trouble." I looked at her, blinking slowly, playing the confused old man perfectly. "Jasmine," I asked, my voice slightly raspy. "What are you doing here? Where's my son?" She pushed past me, stepping into the dim, dusty hallway of the old house. She looked around the modest living room, her eyes darting over the old furniture and the faded photographs on the wall. I could see the hidden contempt in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a fresh wave of fake tears. "Darius is at the office," she cried, covering her face with her hands. "He is completely ruined, Roland. The bank froze all of his business accounts this morning without any warning at all." I closed the front door slowly, leaning heavily against the wooden frame. "Froze his accounts," I repeated, making my voice sound weak and bewildered. "Why would they do that to my boy? He worked so hard for that company." Jasmine walked into the center of the living room, standing perfectly in the frame of the primary hidden camera. She dropped her hands, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. "It is a massive federal tax audit," she lied smoothly, the words flowing like absolute poison. "The government flagged a massive discrepancy in his payroll system. They locked his primary capital, and they are threatening to seize his entire company by tomorrow morning. He's going to lose everything, Roland. The business, the apartment, all of his hard work. They might even arrest him for corporate fraud tonight." I let my jaw drop slightly, reaching out to steady myself against the wall. "Arrest him," I whispered, letting my hands shake visibly. No, Darius is a good boy. He does not break the law. You have to tell them it is a terrible mistake." "We tried," Jasmine sobbed, stepping closer to me, reaching out to grab my trembling hands. "But the bank will not listen to us. They said the only way to stop the asset seizure is to provide an immediate proof of liquid capital. We need to show them a financial guarantee today, or they are going to lock him in a federal holding cell." I looked down at her hands, holding mine so tightly. I felt nothing but a cold, hard disgust for the woman touching me. She was using my love for my son as a weapon to destroy me. It was the lowest, most vile tactic a predator could use. But I kept my face perfectly terrified, matching her dramatic performance note for note. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "I am just an old retired man, Jasmine. I do not have millions of dollars to give them. I have my small pension in this old house. Take the house. Tell the bank they can have this house if they just leave my boy alone." Jasmine shook her head, letting a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. "They do not want the house, Roland," she said softly, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But Darius told me about your secondary trust fund, the emergency savings account at the downtown branch." I narrowed my eyes slightly, playing the confused, forgetful father. "The savings account," I mumbled, rubbing my forehead. Yes, I set that up a long time ago, for emergencies." "This is the ultimate emergency, Roland," she pleaded, pulling the thick manila envelope from under her arm. "The bank manager said we can use that account as a corporate guarantee to unfreeze Darius' business. But Darius cannot access the funds because you are the primary signatory. We need your legal permission right now to release the money and save him." She pulled the crisp white papers out of the envelope. It was the forged power of attorney, complete with the fake notary stamp. She held it out to me, her hands shaking with genuine adrenaline. She was so close to her violent payout, she could practically taste the stolen money. "Just sign these guarantee papers, Roland," she urged, her voice tight with desperate anticipation. "It just gives Darius the temporary authority to show the bank the emergency funds. It will clear his name and stop the federal audit immediately. Please, you have to do this for him. You are the only one who can save your son from going to federal prison." I looked at the thick stack of legal documents, and then I looked deeply into her lying, desperate eyes. I knew Silas was waiting for her. I knew this paper was designed to erase my mind and steal my empire. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling violently, and I took the forged documents from her grasp. I was ready to give her exactly what she wanted. I held the thick stack of papers in my shaking hands, looking at the top page with squinted eyes. I pretended that I could not read the small, dense print without my reading glasses. Jasmine placed a gentle guiding hand on the middle of my back, steering me away from the dim hallway. "Let us go sit down at the kitchen table, Roland," she said softly, her voice still coated in that thick, sickening layer of fake sympathy. "It is much brighter in there, and you can see where you need to sign." We moved slowly through the old house. I made sure to drag my feet slightly, letting the wooden floorboards creak loudly under my heavy, uneven steps. The kitchen was warm, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. I sat down heavily on a worn wooden chair, letting out a long, tired breath. Jasmine pulled another chair out, sitting directly across from me, the small table forcing us into a very tight, intimate space. She took the forged documents from my hands, smoothing the crisp white pages flat against the scratched wood. Calvin had hidden a microscopic high-definition camera lens inside the plastic casing of the smoke detector mounted directly above our heads. I knew it was capturing the exact angle of her face, recording every tiny, calculated micro-expression. I knew there was another camera hidden inside the old radio on the counter, recording a perfect profile of her leaning aggressively over my kitchen table. She reached into the pocket of her wrinkled sweater, pulling out a sleek, heavy silver pen. It was an expensive designer writing instrument, completely out of place in my modest, dusty kitchen. She clicked the top of the pen, the sharp metallic sound cutting loudly through the quiet room. "Here's the signature line, Roland," she said, pointing a long, perfectly manicured fingernail at the bottom of the last page. "Just put your name right there, and Darius will be completely safe." I picked up the heavy document again, bringing it very close to my face. I furrowed my brow, acting deeply confused by the dense, aggressive legal jargon she had drafted. What does this specific word mean, Jasmine? I asked, tapping a trembling finger against a massive paragraph in the center of the page. It says full asset transfer and total conservatorship. This does not look like a simple bank guarantee for my boy. This looks like I am giving away my entire life. A sudden flash of pure, violent irritation crossed her face. The sweet, caring, terrified fiancé act completely cracked for just a fraction of a second. She took a sharp breath, her eyes narrowing with cold impatience. It is just standard federal bank language, Roland, she snapped, her voice completely losing its soft, weeping edge. The corporate lawyers always make it sound terrifying and complicated. It is just a temporary legal mechanism. It just means Darius can legally manage the emergency account for 30 days until the massive federal audit clears his business name. I let my hand tremble violently, dropping the heavy paper back onto the wooden table. I do not know, Jasmine, I muttered, shaking my head slowly from side to side. I do not understand these big legal words. Maybe I should call Darius first. Let me hear his voice on the phone. I just want to make sure my son is all right before I sign anything. I reached out slowly, moving my hand toward the old, heavy rotary phone sitting on the kitchen counter. Jasmine slammed her open palm down hard on top of the legal papers, the loud smack echoing sharply in the quiet kitchen. She leaned aggressively across the small table, invading my physical space. Her mask completely vanished, melting away to reveal the ruthless, desperate predator hiding underneath. You cannot call him right now, she hissed, her dark eyes narrowing into cold, terrifying slits. The federal agents are sitting inside his office right this very second, Roland. If you call his cell phone, the government will confiscate the device and they will trace the call straight back to this house. Do you want them to drive out here, kick your front door down, and drag you out of your own home in handcuffs too? I pulled my shaking hand back from the phone, shrinking deep into my wooden chair, playing the role of a completely terrified, broken old man. No, I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured fear. I do not want the police to come here. I do not want any trouble. Then stop asking stupid, useless questions, she commanded, her voice turning into a low, venomous growl. She pushed the heavy stack of papers forcefully across the scratched wood until the blank signature line was resting right under my chin. She reached across the table, pressing the heavy silver pen directly into my shaking hand. She wrapped her cold, tight fingers around mine, forcing my grip around the metal barrel. Sign the paper, Roland. She ordered, a dark, deeply predatory grin finally breaking across her face. Do not be the selfish reason your only son loses his entire life. You owe him this money. You owe him your absolute protection. I looked up at her face, fully absorbing the pure, concentrated malice radiating from her triumphant smile. She truly believed she had completely broken me. She believed she had successfully outsmarted a weak, senile old man. She was absolutely relishing the crushing power she thought she held over my family. She had no idea that the silent cameras above us were recording every single terrifying threat, every lie, and every piece of violent coercion she just used to extort a fake medical conservatorship. I looked down at the silver pen in my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and prepared to close the trap entirely. I looked down at the heavy silver pen in my hand, letting the cold metal rest against my skin. My fingers shook violently, completely selling the illusion of a broken, terrified old man. I let out a long, ragged sigh, letting my shoulders slump forward in total defeat. Jasmine leaned closer, her expensive perfume filling the small, warm space of my kitchen. Her breath was shallow and fast. She was vibrating with pure, unfiltered greed. She thought she was watching the complete surrender of an empire handed over on a single piece of crisp white paper. She thought my shaking hands were a sign of weakness, a symptom of the fake dementia she had paid a disgraced doctor to diagnose. She had no idea that my hands were only shaking with the immense effort it took to keep myself from throwing her out of my house. I pressed the tip of the heavy pen against the bottom line of the forged power of attorney. I moved my hand slowly, deliberately, making the blue ink scratch harshly against the paper. I did not write my legal name. I did not use the smooth, practiced signature that sat in the secure vaults of the downtown bank, securing millions of dollars in corporate assets. Instead, I scrawled a messy, jagged series of letters. I signed the name of my old hunting dog, a loyal hound, who passed away 20 years ago. I looped the letters with a heavy, clumsy hand, making it look like the desperate scribbling of a man who had completely lost his mind. It was a completely void, legally useless signature. Any junior bank teller in the city would take one look at that messy ink, compare it to my master file, and instantly flag the document for massive fraud. But I did not stop there. I moved the silver pen over to the small date line printed neatly next to the signature block. Jasmine tapped the wooden table impatiently, her sharp fingernail clicking a frantic rhythm. "Just right today, date Roland," she urged, her voice completely stripped of the fake weeping sympathy she had used earlier. "We do not have any more time to waste." I nodded slowly, playing the confused, obedient victim. "Yes," I mumbled, keeping my eyes fixed on the paper. "Today, date." I pressed the pen down again, but I did not write the current year. I slowly, deliberately wrote a date from 15 years ago. It was the exact date my beautiful wife had passed away. It was a date permanently burned into my soul, but on this legal document it acted as a massive, glaring temporal error. A document notarized today, but dated a decade and a half ago, was nothing but useless, contradictory garbage. I made sure to lean my body back slightly, pulling my shoulders away from the table. I gave the hidden high-definition camera in the smoke detector above us a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the forged documents. I wanted Calvin to capture the completely void signature, the impossible date, and the heavy brass notary stamp, all in one crisp, undeniable frame. I also wanted the camera to capture the absolute predatory joy radiating from Jasmine's face. She did not even bother to read the messy blue ink. She was too blinded by the adrenaline, too consumed by the desperate need to pay off her violent loan shark. She saw ink on the line and she saw her massive payout secured. I let the heavy silver pen slip from my trembling fingers. It hit the scratched wooden table with a loud, hollow clatter, rolling slowly toward the edge. I looked up at her, letting my eyes fill with fake watery tears. There I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly small and entirely fragile. I signed the papers, Jasmine. Is my boy safe now? Will the federal agents leave his business alone? Will they let him come home tonight? Jasmine snatched the stack of papers off the table with lightning speed, pulling them tightly against her chest as if I might suddenly reach out and steal them back. Her dark eyes were wide, shining with a cold, triumphant light. The heavy, suffocating tension in the small kitchen instantly shattered, replaced by her raw, victorious arrogance. She did not offer me a comforting smile. She did not reach out to hold my trembling hand the way a loving daughter-in-law would. She simply looked down at me, her face completely hardened, entirely devoid of any human empathy. She had what she came for, and the pathetic old man sitting in the wooden chair was no longer useful to her. She carefully folded the crisp white pages, sliding them securely into the thick manila envelope. The sound of the rustling paper was loud in the quiet room. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut, but she was the one caught inside the steel jaws, not me. I sat perfectly still, watching her secure the envelope inside her wrinkled sweater. I thought about Darius sitting in his downtown office, completely unaware of the monster he had invited into our lives. I thought about the deep pain this was going to cause him, the absolute heartbreak of realizing his entire relationship was a calculated financial extraction. It hurt my soul to know I had to put him through this brutal trial. But a father's job is to protect his children even when the medicine tastes like poison. I had to let her expose herself completely in the most undeniable public way possible so Darius would never doubt the truth. I coughed weakly, rubbing my chest, maintaining the illusion of a frail, failing body. "Please, Jasmine," I rasped, leaning heavily on the table. "Call him. Tell Darius his father did everything he could to save him. Tell him I love him." She stood up quickly, pushing her wooden chair back so hard it scraped loudly across the floor. She looked down at me, clutching the envelope, her mask of desperation completely gone. Jasmine snatched the thick manila envelope off the wooden table, holding it tight against her chest. She did not look at me with any trace of gratitude. The fake tears vanished instantly as if they had never existed in the first place. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, cold contempt. "I will tell him, Roland," she said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth or human sympathy. "But you do not need to worry about Darius anymore. I'm taking over the family from here. You should just get some rest before you forget your own name entirely." She turned sharply on her heel, leaving me sitting alone at the kitchen table. I listened to the sharp click of her expensive shoes echoing loudly down the short, dusty hallway. I did not call out to her. I did not move a single muscle, maintaining the perfect illusion of a broken man until I heard the heavy front door slam shut. The old house fell perfectly heavily silent. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen for a long moment, staring at the empty wooden chair across from me. I slowly straightened my back, rolling my shoulders, letting the painful, hunched posture of the frail old man melt away completely. I reached under the thick knitted blanket on my lap, pulling out my heavy, secure satellite phone. I pressed a single button, connecting directly to the surveillance hub downtown. "Do you have the footage?" "Calvin?" I asked, my voice dropping back to its normal, deep, and completely steady tone. "I have every single frame," Roland Calvin replied instantly, his voice coming through the small speaker crisp and clear. "The audio is absolutely flawless. We caught the blatant coercion, the forged medical diagnosis lying on the table, and the undeniable threat about the federal agents. She handed you a loaded legal gun, and she practically begged you to pull the trigger on camera." "Package the raw video files, Calvin Watts," I commanded, standing up from the small wooden table and taking off the heavy knitted cardigan. "Send a secure encrypted copy to Vanessa tonight. Tell our favorite ruthless corporate attorney that it is time to prepare the final legal strike. The trap is completely set. We close the steel jaws on her tomorrow night." Outside the old house, Jasmine practically sprinted down the cracked concrete driveway. She did not look back at the faded porch or the dusty windows. She threw open the heavy door of her white luxury SUV, climbing into the driver's seat with a frantic electric energy. She tossed the thick manila envelope onto the passenger seat, staring at it like it was a solid brick of pure, untouchable gold. She let out a loud, piercing scream of absolute victory, slamming her hands happily against the leather steering wheel. The suffocating weight of the terrifying morning was completely gone. She had successfully outsmarted a massive, wealthy empire, using nothing but a cheap crying performance and a few forged signatures. She pulled her sleek cell phone from her designer leather bag, her perfectly manicured fingers flying rapidly across the glowing screen. She bypassed her normal contact list, dialing a heavily encrypted, unlisted local number. The phone rang 3 long times in the quiet cabin of the SUV before a cold, painfully familiar voice answered the line. "I hope you are calling with exceptionally good news, Jasmine," Silas said, his low voice vibrating with a terrifying calm threat. "Because I am currently looking at a very empty financial ledger and your Friday deadline is coming very fast. I have the money. Silas, Jasmine practically yelled into the phone, completely unable to contain her wild, rushing adrenaline. I have the entire $500,000 and it is perfectly clean. The old man just signed the primary family trust over to Darius, along with a full medical conservatorship. He gave up all his legal rights. He is completely legally insane as of today. Silas paused on the other end of the line, the heavy silence speaking volumes about his dangerous, highly calculating mind. "You got the old wealthy father to just hand over the master keys?" Silas asked, a dark hint of amusement slipping into his cold tone. "He is a pathetic, senile old fool," Jasmine sneered, looking proudly at the thick envelope. I played the terrified, loyal fiancé. I told him the federal government was coming to arrest his precious son, and he signed the legal papers without even reading the fine print. I hold the absolute legal power now, Silas. Darius is so blinded by his own panic he will authorize the massive wire transfer to my shell company tomorrow afternoon, thinking he is paying off a federal tax audit. And when exactly do I see my massive return on investment? Silas demanded, completely cutting through her arrogant, loud celebration. I do not care about your little family dramas, Jasmine. I only care about the heavy cash in my hand. Tomorrow night, Jasmine promised, eagerly pushing the start button to ignite the loud engine of her luxury vehicle. I am organizing a private, highly formal dinner at the best restaurant downtown. I am bringing my own crooked corporate lawyer to legally execute the trust transfer right at the dinner table. Once the ink dries on the final bank authorization, I will wire your $500,000 directly to your untraceable offshore account. You will have your money 24 hours before your violent deadline. See that you do, Jasmine. Silas replied coldly. Because if that wire transfer bounces tomorrow night, I will send my heavy associates to that fancy downtown restaurant and we will serve you as the main course. The line went dead with a sharp, heavy click. Jasmine tossed the phone carelessly onto the empty passenger seat, totally unfazed by the violent, literal death threat. She put the heavy SUV into gear, pulling recklessly out of the gravel driveway and speeding away from the run-down neighborhood. She felt completely, undeniably invincible. She had the fake medical diagnosis, the forged power of attorney, and the absolute emotional control over a wealthy, gullible heir. Tomorrow night, she was going to walk into a high-end restaurant, strip the old man of his entire life, and walk out as a millionaire. She smiled a sharp, highly predatory smile, turning the car radio up loud, completely unaware of the massive, catastrophic ruin waiting for her in the dark. The crystal chandeliers of the downtown restaurant cast a warm, golden glow over the private dining room. It was the most expensive steakhouse in Atlanta, a place where millionaires closed massive corporate deals over heavy glasses of aged scotch. Jasmine sat at the head of the long mahogany table wearing a brand new form-fitting black dress she had bought on a desperate line of credit. She felt completely, undeniably powerful. The thick manila envelope holding the forged legal documents rested right next to her silver salad fork. She looked across the table at her crooked lawyer, a slick, fast-talking man named Richard. Richard wore a cheap suit that he tried to pass off as Italian tailoring, and he possessed the moral compass of a starving vulture. Jasmine had promised him $20,000 in cash straight from the stolen trust fund just to sit at this table and legitimize her massive theft. Richard took a slow sip of his expensive red wine, looking at the heavy envelope. "You are absolutely sure the old man signed away the primary trust?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. Jasmine smiled a cold, sharp expression that did not reach her eyes. "He did not just sign it, Richard," she replied smoothly. "He practically begged me to take it. He thinks he is saving his precious son from a massive federal tax audit. I played the terrified, weeping fiancé perfectly, and he handed me the keys to his entire empire." Richard chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound in the quiet room. "And the doctor signed off on the dementia diagnosis?" he asked, swirling the dark wine in his glass. "I paid a desperate, disgraced doctor $3,000 to declare him completely legally insane." Jasmine answered, leaning back in her plush velvet chair. The medical evaluation is absolutely ironclad. The bank manager will take one look at that paperwork, and he will hand Darius the master control to the entire financial portfolio tonight. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room opened slowly, and Darius walked in. He looked completely exhausted, carrying the heavy weight of the world on his shoulders. His designer suit was slightly wrinkled and dark, heavy circles shadowed his eyes. He had spent the entire day fighting with hostile bank tellers and staring at frozen computer screens, terrified that he was going to lose his entire life work. Jasmine instantly dropped her cold, predatory smile. She morphed back into the loving, deeply concerned partner, standing up quickly to greet him. "Darius, baby," she cried, rushing across the room to wrap her arms around his neck. "I'm so glad you made it." Darius hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder, letting out a long, ragged sigh. "It has been a total nightmare today, Jess," he whispered, his voice cracking with pure exhaustion. "I cannot access a single dollar. The payroll checks are going to bounce tomorrow morning, and the vendors are threatening to sue my company." Jasmine pulled back slightly, looking up at him with wide, shining eyes. "It is going to be okay, baby," she promised, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "I fixed everything. I went to see your father today, just like we talked about." Darius looked at her, completely stunned. "You went to the old house?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Did he yell at you? Did he try to deny the fraud report?" Jasmine shook her head slowly, leading him toward the empty chair next to her. "No, baby," she said softly, acting like a gentle, healing angel. "When I got there, I realized he did not orchestrate the bank freeze out of spite. He is very sick, Darius. He is losing his mind. He did not even remember our argument from the party. He was terrified and confused, and he just wanted to help you." Darius sat down heavily, staring at her across the white tablecloth. "What do you mean he is sick?" he asked, a wave of genuine, painful concern washing over his tired face. "I brought someone to help us explain the legal situation," Jasmine said, gesturing toward the slick lawyer sitting quietly across the table. "Darius, this is Richard. He is a specialist in family estates and emergency corporate transfers." Richard offered a tight, professional smile, reaching across the table to shake hands. "Good evening, Darius," he said smoothly. "Your fiancé has been working tirelessly today to save your business from this sudden financial crisis." Darius looked back and forth between them, completely overwhelmed. "Save my business? How?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Jasmine picked up the heavy manila envelope, pulling out the crisp white papers. "Your father signed this power of attorney today, Darius," she explained, sliding the forged documents across the mahogany table. "He voluntarily transferred the primary control of the family trust over to you. He knows he is not mentally capable of managing the massive wealth anymore." Darius stared at the bold black ink on the page, his eyes scanning the sweeping legal powers. "He gave me the trust," he whispered, completely unable to process the massive shift in his reality. "Why would he do that if he hates me so much?" "He does not hate you, baby," Jasmine lied effortlessly, resting her hand gently over his. "He is just suffering from severe dementia. I even had a top neurologist evaluate his medical records today. He is legally incompetent, Darius, but his tragic sickness is going to save our entire life tonight. We just need you to sign the final acceptance clause right now, and Richard will authorize the bank to release the emergency funds to my secure accounts immediately." Darius looked down at the messy, jagged signature scrawled at the bottom of the page. It did not look anything like his father's handwriting. It looked like the desperate scribbling of a completely broken mind. He felt a deep, agonizing stab of guilt in his chest. He had blamed his father for ruining his life while the old man was secretly suffering from a devastating mental collapse. Jasmine picked up her heavy silver pen, holding it out to him with a bright, encouraging smile. "Just sign the paper, baby," she urged, her voice trembling with hidden violent greed. "Sign it right now, and we can finally be free." Darius slowly reached out his hand, shaking, and took the cold metal pen from her fingers. Darius held the heavy silver pen, his hand trembling slightly over the forged signature line. He looked at the jagged, messy ink of his father, feeling a deep, suffocating wave of grief. Jasmine leaned closer to him, her eyes locked onto the tip of the pen, holding her breath in pure, agonizing anticipation. "Just sign it, baby," she whispered, her voice tight and desperate, pushing him toward the edge of the cliff. Darius lowered the heavy pen, the silver tip hovering just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room burst open with a sudden, deafening crack. The loud sound shattered the quiet tension echoing sharply off the crystal chandeliers above them. Darius jumped in his seat, dropping the heavy silver pen, watching it roll harmlessly across the polished mahogany table. Jasmine gasped loudly, spinning around in her velvet chair, her face flushing with a sudden, furious anger. A fierce woman strode into the private dining room, moving with the cold, unstoppable force of a hurricane. It was Vanessa. She wore a flawless, tailored charcoal suit, and she carried a sleek black leather briefcase. She did not look like a woman who asked for permission from anyone in the city. She looked like a woman who owned the entire building and everyone inside it. Two massive, broad-shouldered men in dark suits followed closely behind her. They stepped smoothly into the room, their faces completely blank, and closed the heavy oak doors with a solid, terrifying thud. One of the men reached out and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, locking them all securely inside. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Richard shouted, jumping up from his chair, trying desperately to project a fake legal authority. "You cannot just barge into a private dining room and lock the doors on my clients. I will call the police right now and have you all arrested for false imprisonment and aggressive harassment." Vanessa did not even look at the crooked lawyer. She walked straight toward the head of the table, her sharp heels clicking a terrifying rhythmic beat against the expensive hardwood floor. She stopped right next to Darius, looking down at the forged power of attorney lying on the table with absolute disgust. "Put your phone away, Richard." Vanessa commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. "Unless you want the police to see the forged notary stamp sitting right in front of you." "And you?" she said, turning her cold, piercing gaze toward Jasmine. "Do not move a single muscle, or my private security team will forcefully restrain you to that chair." Jasmine felt a sudden icy drop in her stomach, a cold dread completely paralyzing her limbs. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a sudden undeniable terror. "You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a private, delicate family matter. I am the primary legal counsel for the Apex Holdings Trust," Vanessa replied calmly, setting her heavy briefcase down on the table right on top of the fake medical diagnosis. "And I am here tonight to stop a massive, highly documented felony from taking place over expensive stakes." Darius looked up at the fierce, imposing woman, his mind completely unable to process the sudden chaos in the room. "Apex Holdings," he whispered, his voice full of pure confusion. "That is the massive company that bought my apartment building today. What do you have to do with my private family trust?" Before Vanessa could answer the confused son, the heavy brass deadbolt clicked open again. The oak doors swung wide and a tall, imposing figure stepped out of the dim hallway and into the bright, golden light of the dining room. Jasmine stared at the doorway, and all the breath completely vanished from her lungs. It was Roland, but he was not wearing a cheap faded cardigan or worn-out leather shoes. He was not hunched over, shivering with a fake, fragile weakness. He stood perfectly straight, his broad shoulders filling the entire doorframe. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored, midnight blue suit cut perfectly from the finest Italian wool. A crisp, white silk pocket square rested sharply against his chest. He did not look like a poor, retired insurance adjuster. He looked like a massive billionaire stepping onto a legal battlefield he entirely controlled. He walked slowly into the room, his stride heavy, confident, and completely terrifying. He did not drag his feet across the floor. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of an alpha predator finally cornering its desperate prey. He stopped at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, looking directly at Jasmine. His eyes were not confused or clouded by advanced dementia. They were sharp, cold, and burning with absolute total destruction. Dad Darius breathed out, standing up slowly from his chair, his eyes wide with utter shock. "What are you wearing tonight? What is going on here? I thought you were incredibly sick. I thought you lost your mind this afternoon. I am perfectly healthy, Darius." Roland said, his deep, resonant voice filling every single corner of the large room. "I have never been sharper in my entire life. But I had to play the confused fool today so the deadly snake hiding in your bed would finally come out and strike." Jasmine gripped the sharp edge of the table, her knuckles turning a pale white. She looked at the expensive Italian suit, the massive security guards, and the ruthless corporate lawyer standing next to her prey. The grand, perfect illusion of her massive financial heist completely shattered into a million sharp pieces. She had not manipulated a senile, pathetic old man. She had walked completely blind straight into the crushing jaws of a sleeping giant. "This is an elaborate trick," Jasmine screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Roland, desperately trying to salvage her rapidly collapsing lie. "He is legally insane, Darius. Look at the medical paperwork on the table. Look at the official diagnosis. He is just having a violent paranoid episode right now. He hired these actors to confuse you because he wants to steal your entire company back." Roland let out a short, dark laugh, a deep sound that held absolutely zero humor. He looked at Vanessa, nodding his head slightly, giving her the silent signal. "Let us show my son the absolute truth, Vanessa," he commanded quietly. "Let us show him exactly who he almost married." Vanessa popped the heavy brass locks on her black leather briefcase with a sharp, satisfying click. She did not pull out a single piece of paper. She pulled out a thick, massive stack of highly classified forensic files, dropping them heavily onto the polished table right next to the forged power of attorney. The loud slap of the heavy folders echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Vanessa opened the thick blue folder, spreading a massive fan of glossy documents across the white tablecloth. Darius stared at the heavy paper, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift in gravity. The crooked lawyer Richard started to reach for his cheap briefcase, but one of the massive security guards stepped forward, instantly placing a heavy, crushing hand on his shoulder. "You will sit perfectly still, Richard," Vanessa commanded, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room, "or I will have you permanently disbarred and locked in a federal cell by tomorrow morning." Vanessa turned her cold, piercing gaze to Darius, sliding the first dense document toward him. "Your fiancé told you a beautiful, terrifying lie today, Darius." She began tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the official gold seal. "She told you the bank froze your accounts because of a massive federal tax audit. That is entirely false. I froze those accounts at exactly 9 o'clock this morning under the direct, unyielding order of the primary trust holder, your father." Darius looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading for an explanation. "Why, Dad?" he asked, his voice cracking with pure, agonizing betrayal. "Why would you destroy my business like that?" "I did not destroy your business, son," I replied, keeping my voice deep and entirely steady. "I built a massive financial wall around it to completely protect you from the lethal predator sitting right next to you." Vanessa slid the second heavy document across the polished mahogany. It was a dense, highly complex legal charter printed on thick parchment. "This is the master document for the Apex Holdings Trust," Vanessa explained, looking directly at Jasmine, watching the color completely drain from her panicked face. "It dictates that every single asset, every dollar in the emergency fund and the luxury apartment building you lived in is permanently locked inside an irrevocable trust. Do you know what that specific legal term means, Jasmine? Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat completely dry, unable to speak a single defiant word. It means the money is completely untouchable, Vanessa stated, delivering the first crushing blow with absolute precision. Even if this forged power of attorney was legally valid, which it absolutely is not, Darius does not have the legal authority to liquidate a single dime. You cannot steal what is permanently locked away in a titanium vault. You spent an entire year building a massive, elaborate trap to steal a completely empty box. Jasmine gripped the arms of her velvet chair, her mind spinning frantically, desperately trying to find a single crack in the impenetrable wall closing around her. It does not matter, she hissed, her voice trembling with a desperate, venomous rage. I have the signed medical diagnosis. He is legally insane. The courts will give Darius the master control eventually. Vanessa let out a sharp, cold laugh, a sound that held absolutely no mercy. The courts are going to be very busy with you, Jasmine, she said, pulling a thick stack of glossy photographs from the final folder and tossing them onto the center of the table. Or should I call you by your real name, which is highly documented by federal fraud investigators in 3 different states? Darius looked down at the scattered photos, his breath catching painfully in his chest. They were clear surveillance pictures. Pictures of Jasmine meeting with violent, dangerous men in dark parking garages. Pictures of her standing outside cheap motels long before she ever bought a single designer dress. Your beautiful fiancé is a serial con artist. Darius. Vanessa revealed her words, striking like a heavy hammer on a steel anvil. She targets wealthy men, isolates them completely from their families, and drains their accounts through fake real estate shells. But she made a catastrophic mistake 6 months ago. She borrowed $500,000 from a highly violent loan shark named Silas to fund the luxury illusion she used to trap you. And Silas gave her until this Friday night to pay him back in full, or he is going to violently end her life. Darius shrank back in his chair, completely horrified, looking at the woman he loved as if she were a total terrifying stranger. You owe a mobster $500,000. He whispered, his voice hollow and entirely broken. You were going to use my emergency fund to pay off a violent criminal. Jasmine reached out to him, fresh, frantic tears streaming down her pale face. No, baby, she cried, her voice pitching up in pure, unfiltered panic. They are lying to you. Your father fabricated all of this evidence just to ruin our perfect life. He is a jealous, hateful old man, and he bribed these people to frame me.